Hi guys, today we will start with the story Crown on a Sick Head, the heir with the seal of death, the curse in youth. On summer evenings, the air over Jerusalem felt heavy, as if saturated with incense, sweat, and dust. The sky faded slowly, shifting from gold to crimson, while the city drowned in the sounds of evening prayer and hurried footsteps. On such evenings, young Baldwin, heir to the throne of Jerusalem, preferred solitude. He had no interest in the games of other boys or the talk of grown men. There was something different in him, something elusive, like a shadow living behind his gaze. He was a child of noble blood, raised in strictness and prayer, surrounded from early childhood by the chill of marble and the scent of frankincense. Tutors taught him Latin, theology, swordsmanship, and history, instilling the belief that he was chosen to bear the Lord's cross. He studied diligently, absorbing knowledge with fanatical focus, as if trying to defeat something that had already taken root within him. The first sign came quietly. It happened during a riding lesson. He fell from his horse, but to the instructor's surprise, did not cry out. He stood, dusted himself off, and tried to mount again. His hand was bleeding, but the boy didn't notice. The instructor looked into his face. No pain, no fear. Only a strange, detached focus. It wasn't courage. It was the absence of pain. Later, when the wound was being washed, Baldwin sat calmly, without flinching. He stared out the window at the dusty road down which pilgrims traveled. It was then that his instructor, an old Frank named Guillaume, first thought of leprosy. He didn't dare speak the word aloud, but cold fear stirred in him. He had seen such cases before. Children with strange spots on their skin, like a map of doom. Children who slowly lost all sense of pain, of touch, of being. The first spot was small. On his right shoulder, pale, painless, and persistent. Then came another. His mother noticed them and called a physician, but the man only shook his head. He spoke of skin weakness, of temporary fragility, but his eyes were wary. The courtiers began watching the young prince with a new attentiveness, not out of respect, but anxious suspicion, as if they sensed something dark was brewing within his body. Baldwin became quiet during those days. He secluded himself in palace corners, spent hours in the chapel or on the citadel walls. He watched people, soldiers at training, monks in procession, beggars at the gates. He noticed in every movement, every glance, something he himself seemed to lack. He was 12 years old and he already knew he was dying. But he did not cry. He didn't seek his mother's comfort. He did not protest to God. He simply lived, observing how his body betrayed him slowly, treacherously, how dead flesh overtook his childhood. Every day he tested himself. Could he feel the cold of water, the prick of a needle, the heat of fire? And every day he felt less. His face remained handsome, youthful, almost angelic. But beneath the skin, destruction had begun. The disease was patient. It was in no hurry. It hid beneath the flesh like a serpent under marble and waited. Those around him grew increasingly concerned. The king's advisors spoke in whispers. What to do if the heir was ill? How to transfer power? How to suppress the rumors? But Baldwin himself asked no questions. He continued studying, practicing swordplay, attending services, sitting in the olive shade, as if a resolve lived within him that did not match his age. He knew, perhaps not in words, but with his whole being. He felt something growing inside him that could not be cut out, not healed with oils or prayers. Leprosy was no longer just a spot on his shoulder. It was in his soul, a knowledge that his time would not be measured in years, but in will. And if he would live, it would not be for himself. Thus began the story of the king with the veiled face. The teacher. Noticed William of Tyre, the tutor of the young prince, was not simply a scholar. He was observant, patient, and well aware that heirs of royal blood had to be handled with caution. He had been educated in Europe, in monasteries where time moved slowly, like ink across parchment. He had seen wars, betrayals, and death on the streets of Acre, and had learned to recognize not only lies in one's eyes, but also the silence of pain. It was he who first saw that something dreadful was happening to Baldwin. The boy was always gifted, too gifted. His memory astounded. He could quote Augustine without glancing at the page, grasped Aristotle's logic with ease, and understood the papal bull's political subtleties better than many adult vassals. But it wasn't just his mind that stood out. He was hardy, agile, skillful with a sword, leaping from a horse like a young knight, and never backing down in physical contests. And yet, something unsettled William. It wasn't his mind, but his body. Something others refused to see. One day during fencing practice, Baldwin was sparring with two boys using wooden swords. His movements were sharp and confident, but suddenly one opponent struck his hand, sharply, forcefully. The prince didn't flinch. He kept fighting as if nothing had happened. Only after the session, when William examined his hand, did the injury become clear. Fingers bleeding, skin torn, nails bruised. Baldwin looked at the wound calmly, too calmly. He didn't even try to hide it. It wasn't bravery or pretense. It was a complete absence of sensation. William asked him to sit and examine the hand. He touched, pressed, traced a quill across the skin. Baldwin didn't wince. He seemed bored. This was no game. It was truth. And it chilled William's blood. Later that night, by the dim flicker of library candles, William searched through old texts about a disease, a curse from ancient times, of those immune to pain, of people whose flesh died while their spirit remained. He remembered an old woman in Antioch, whose face had decayed to bone, but who still prayed and sang psalms until she was shut away from the world. He didn't want to believe. He prayed all night, standing before the image of the Savior, begging it be a mistake. He sought explanations. Damaged nerves, trauma, exhaustion. But by morning, the patch on Baldwin's shoulder had grown. It caused no pain. It simply existed. And now, in his other hand, he no longer felt heat or cold when pressed. Leprosy doesn't kill quickly. It kills slowly, turning a person into a shadow of themselves. William knew this illness cursed not only the body, but the name. He didn't tell the king right away. He needed to observe, to be certain. He devised secret tests, gave Baldwin hot objects, pricked him with needles under the guise of reflex checks, made him hold his hand in icy water. The result was always the same. The body did not know pain. He saw Baldwin's gaze change. The boy became quieter, as if he sensed his doom. There was no terror in him, only maturity. He began keeping a journal, reading more, staying alone. He would retreat into palace shadows, sit on stone benches in the garden, listen to silence as though listening to his own body, to its treacherous silence. He never complained, never spoke a word of what was happening. But his silence screamed. William tried to help. He summoned physicians, alchemists, monks. All said the same. Perhaps it wasn't leprosy. But no one truly believed that. One doctor dared to look at Baldwin's bare hand and recoiled. He said nothing, but his face went pale. Soon after, he left the court without saying goodbye. William decided to remain silent. Too much was at stake. A leprous heir could never rule. The church, the knights, the people, none would accept it. He continued the boy's education as if nothing was wrong. Textbooks, rhetoric, histories of campaigns, moral reasoning, all as usual. But inside, William was being consumed by dread. One evening, he watched Baldwin sleep by the window, head resting on a silk cushion, face turned to the moon. And it seemed to him he wasn't seeing a child, but a figure from legend, a young martyr chosen by God not for joy, but for trial. He understood then that the boy knew, that Baldwin could feel, even without feeling through his skin. that a dark chapter in his fate had begun, one without escape. From that day on, William no longer doubted. He was no longer merely a tutor. He had become the silent witness of a tragedy he had to conceal from the world. Diagnosis without hope. By the end of autumn, the air in Jerusalem had thinned. The dry wind swept dust along ancient walls, and in the olive groves at night, the howls of jackals echoed. Baldwin had turned 13. His body grew like any boy's. Bones lengthened, his voice became thinner, his gaze deeper. But with that growth came something that could not be called maturity. His illness was gaining strength. His skin began to dull. His fingers lost flexibility. It seemed as though parts of his body lived separately from the rest, slow, lazy, like marionettes forgotten under the sun. First, it was his left leg that started to betray him. He couldn't feel the ground beneath his steps. His toes stopped bending. He would step on sharp stones and not notice the cuts. He still trained, with sword, with spear, in armor. His teachers watched him with unease. His movements seemed too precise, detached from the body, as if guided only by mind. He won, but every strike rang in the armor with a hollow thud. One day he dropped his sword and didn't bend to pick it up. Because he hadn't noticed, he dropped it. William saw. He still hid the truth, though he knew hiding was futile. Pale patches began to appear on Baldwin's skin, the surface deadened. Wounds didn't heal, but neither did they hurt. He wore gloves even in the heat, covered his face with light fabric. His servants asked no questions. They simply tried not to look too long. One day in January's chill, when the wind brought scents from the north, dusty, Bedouin, soaked in incense and blood, William took Baldwin to a monk named Augustine. This was a man who lived in a half-abandoned cell beyond the city walls, a former physician from Antioch, exiled for heresy, for trying to heal the incurable. He was their last hope, or their final sentence. Augustine looked at the boy's hand. He didn't remain silent. He didn't offer false comfort. He ran his palm along the wrist, felt the elbow, lifted the eyelid. Then, quietly, almost in a whisper, he spoke the word that itself became a sentence: leprosy. He didn't say, perhaps. He didn't say, likely. He simply stated, the disease was here, in the blood, in the nerves, in the skin. It could not be driven out by prayer, by abstinence, or by knowledge. This was not punishment, nor a trial. It was fact. William stood with his eyes lowered. Baldwin stood still. He asked no questions, not out of fear, not out of humility, but because he had known all along. The monk only confirmed what his body had been whispering for years. Now it was official, and possibly fatal. The diagnosis was given in silence. The monk offered an herbal tincture, not for healing, but to slow the spread. He said the disease might progress slowly, that with a strong spirit a person could live for years, even a decade. But he also said every day would be a battle, against the body, against suspicion, against one's own name. Baldwin did not flinch. He returned to the palace that same evening. At dinner, he said nothing. Later, he ordered the mirror removed from his chamber. He no longer wanted to look at the face that would one day become foreign. He resumed his lessons, with the same determination, the same focus, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Rumors began to slip through. A servant saw the bandages. Another noticed the pale patches. One page whispered to another how the prince felt no burn from a candle. Soon, whispers became echoes in the corridors of the palace. Advisors began to discuss succession. Some in silence in the shadows. Others more openly. But the king said nothing. His mother prayed. And Baldwin lived. He began studying state matters, spent hours in the library with documents, studied taxes, chains of command, geography of the realm. He already knew he would be king, and he knew he could not rule for long. But he also understood, because of this illness, not in spite of it, he must be ready to reign, because each of his days was a delayed death, and thus a chance at immortality. His face for now remained intact. Only one corner of his mouth began to twitch when he spoke. His hand weakened slightly. But this was only the beginning. He could feel the illness creeping behind him like a shadow along a stone wall. Slowly, surely, inevitably. Here was the truth. There was no hope, but there was purpose. Secret at court. At first, the illness was hidden. Whispers drifted through the palace corridors like drafts in empty halls. Silent, but penetrating. The servants asked no questions, but their eyes grew more attentive, and their bows a little deeper. They sensed that an invisible wall was rising around the young prince. Not political, not religious, but physical. Dreadful, ancient. A wall of silence. The royal court, like a mirror, reflected not truth but appearances. And Baldwin's image remained that of an heir. Fair-haired, sharp-eyed, disciplined, courageous, silent. He still rode on horseback, still appeared at ceremonies, still sat beside the king during council meetings. There was no fear in him, no self-pity, and that was his weapon. His strength lay in never allowing the world to see his weakness. But the secret did not vanish. It seemed to live in the stone tiles, in the rustle of manuscript pages, in the bitterness of the herbal ointments rubbed into his skin. Every day for Baldwin began earlier than for anyone else. He rose before dawn, not by choice, but because he could not sleep. His body obeyed, but there was a coldness growing within. Not from climate, but from inside. He felt no touch, but he felt the truth. His time did not belong to him. Only his mother knew everything. Melisande, the queen mother, prayed through the nights as the oil lamps dimmed in her chambers. She kept the secret with the same bravery she once used to hold command of fortresses. She hired physicians, begged crusaders to bring ointments from the East, herbs from India, pelts from Byzantium, gold that might be exchanged for hope. All in vain, and she knew it. But she continued to fight, because giving up meant admitting defeat. The council knew, or suspected. Some quietly, with cold anxiety. Others with the hope that the illness would remove the heir and open the path for other claimants. Baldwin saw their gazes, calculating, cautious, counting down his days. But no one dared to speak aloud, because as long as he sat straight, spoke clearly, and ruled wisely, he remained the living embodiment of the crown's will. Even if his flesh betrayed him, his mind was still sharp as steel. Hiding the illness during festivals was the hardest. In the banquet hall, under torchlight and the clink of goblets, as Syrian dancers twirled in silk and emirs, and barons offered toasts, Baldwin sat on the dais like a youthful god, with a face devoid of pain that did not hurt. He smiled when needed, but his eyes remained unchanged, for in them already lived a fate that none would share. When envoys from Europe arrived in the city, Baldwin faced something that would later become his constant mask: public strength veiling private decay. He stood beside his father, held the scepter, spoke with confidence. No one could have guessed that beneath the mail, his body was wrapped in bandages, that on his feet he wore special sandals lined with soft cloth to hide the trophies of painless wounds. The secret became a burden, not for him, for others. He had already learned not to fear. But the courtiers were afraid, because the truth they concealed was more terrifying than war. A Leper King was not just a weakness. It was the fear of divine curse, a dread of God's judgment. And so, it was not only a disease, it was a symbol, both for enemies and for his people. Baldwin knew. One day, the truth would come out. But he also knew he would forge his legacy before they could rip away the veils. He was building himself like a fortress, not from flesh, but from will. He read through the nights until his blood cooled. He studied maps, tactics, finances. He observed how grown men ruled, and saw that often Their weakness was worse than any disease. He became the silent center of the palace. Around him swirled ambition, fear, intrigue, but within him lived concentration, like the calm eye of a storm. He did not know how long he had, but he knew that in these brief years, he must become someone remembered not for the illness, but for what he did. And the secret at court, day by day, became not a curse, but a weapon. The heir marked by death. He became an heir with the sentence already pronounced. His skin no longer felt touch. Like a land without rain, no longer feels the steps of a traveler. The disease didn't scream. It whispered methodically, like water carving stone. He was still young, but within him had already begun to grow something rare even in adulthood, a clear awareness of his own mortality. Baldwin IV accepted his fate without tragedy, just as a warrior dons his armor, knowing it won't prevent death, only delay it. Becoming the Prince of Jerusalem, he did not drown in luxury or in the comforts of courtly affection. His mind was tense, like a drawn bowstring, and no movement within the palace escaped his notice. He read reports from the provinces, studied who collected taxes and how much, who was loyal, who hesitated to follow commands. He was not yet king, but already he knew what power smelled like. A mixture of blood, incense, and mistrust. Leprosy advanced slowly, like an army crossing the desert, relentless, merciless. First, the feeling left his feet, then his hands. He could no longer sense the heat of wine-filled goblets, nor the weight of a sword. They taught him to wield weapons not with strength, but with sheer will. Servants changed his bandages at night, while others slept, to keep gossip at bay. No one was to see that the body of the heir was already decaying while he lived. But his spirit did not submit. He learned Latin, Greek, and some Arabic. He read the chronicles of Alexander, the tactical commentaries of Julius Caesar, the sermons of St. Augustine. He studied not only how to rule, but how to battle shadows, both in men and in himself. He was not granted time for illusions. Every day he lived as if it were his last. And in that lay his invulnerability. What destroyed others through fear, in him became steel. When King Amalric fell to fever, and the scent of power drifted through the palace halls, not incense, but the sharp air of transition, Baldwin was ready. He was not yet 15, but he saw in the elders' eyes a quiet confusion. They knew death followed him. Yet they had no better choice. Others were healthy but weak. He was dying, yet steadfast. For he already lived on the edge, where life is bought at the price of loss. He never sought pity. In his gestures, his words, his decisions, there was no plea for mercy. His voice remained steady, his judgments cold and clear. He learned to sit upright even when his bones ached. He met the gaze of warriors, knowing they were reading not sickness in his eyes, but authority. He understood, in a world where prophets and swords determine fates, even a leper may rule, if his spirit is sharper than any blade. As the disease claimed his body, he conquered with his mind. In talks with envoys, he skillfully sidestepped verbal traps. In matters of taxation, he showed a shrewdness that bordered on ruthless. He knew that ruling was not only about faith or justice, it was about order, built on pain, fear, and the fine line between duty and compulsion. He lived on that line. He was that line. Often Baldwin would look out from the fortress walls. Jerusalem sprawled below, like sacred fire, earthly and unreachable at once. He did not know whether he would live to see the sun scorch Acre's walls or the banners of Saladin rise on the horizon. But he knew that while he breathed, this city would not fall. Not because he was strong in body, but because he had already surrendered the body and remained mind alone. Rumors of his illness still crept through the city. A careless physician, a talkative servant, truth leaked. Yet the secret turned into strength. People began to see in him not weakness, but purpose. a sufferer touched by grace, a strange and luminous king. His pain became part of a legend that hadn't even fully begun. In him, they saw a sign, and signs frighten, but also command. Thus, the youth marked by death became someone feared and obeyed. Because he was not simply alive, he lived in defiance. And in a world of short lives and long campaigns, that meant more than immortality. The crown upon a sickened head. Baldwin ascended the throne at the age of 13. In that moment, when his young face, already stretched tight with pain, rose above the crowd like a symbol not of triumph, but of inevitable fate, he was no longer a boy. He ascended not merely as an heir, but as a living testament that power is not always a gift. It is often a heavy cross. His hands, already no longer his own, were hidden beneath gloves, concealing not only the traces of illness, but the creeping helplessness that had become a part of his existence. The coronation ceremony was grand, as was fitting for Jerusalem. Yet even in the sacred moment of anointing, when the golden crown was placed upon his head with solemn brilliance, the world looked at him with cautious reverence, not as a healthy ruler, but as a dying king clinging to life. Baldwin sat upon his throne, tall and strong like Jerusalem itself, but his skin was pale to the point of translucence, and his eyes, too knowing for his years, seemed to see beyond the horizon, to places others could not glimpse. The throne became his cage. He was king, but had no right to weakness. Every movement was an act of endurance. Those who expected the crown to bestow strength were disappointed, for his strength was not of the flesh. It resided in his spirit. Despite illness, despite his body's gradual betrayal, his decisions became clearer than ever. He was not the type of ruler to storm palace halls with thunderous rage, as many young monarchs did. His power was quiet, almost invisible, but it was felt by all. He ruled not with blades, but with thought. His body grew weaker, but his mind remained razor sharp. He understood that he had to embrace his fragility, for only by understanding his own vulnerability could he become invincible in politics. The crown that rested upon his head was not just a symbol of dominion, it was a symbol of sacrifice. He was surrounded by many, yet profoundly alone. He viewed his position not as privilege, but as burden, knowing that every moment of his life was a miracle that could vanish without warning. And so, he taught himself to think ahead, several steps beyond all others. He read every glance, every gesture, every piece of advice, every decision had a hidden context. He learned to see who among his council was truly loyal and who merely waited for his fall. The coronation passed. Baldwin sat on the throne, motionless, not out of pride, but because any movement brought pain. Yet his eyes were full of resolve, and his voice was steady. In that moment, though his body was frail and failing, his will stood unshaken. In his gaze and in the cadence of his words, there was no sign of weakness, only the gravity of command. He knew that even if he were to die tomorrow, his legacy would not. He had to leave behind not just a kingdom, but an example of indomitable spirit. In his governance, in his responses to threats, in his political maneuverings, there was a strength that did not depend on his physical state. His suffering had become his strength. He knew how to lead men because he lived every moment at the brink of death. Each day, his illness progressed, and he became more and more isolated from the world. But he understood that he could not allow himself pity. No tears were permitted to fall upon his face, no weakness allowed to crack his spirit. He taught himself to be untouchable, to rise above what others believed impossible. His strength did not lie in wielding a sword, but in bearing the responsibility of a nation, even as his own body betrayed him. And each morning he awoke, he knew it was his last chance to do something meaningful, something that would be remembered. His crown, not the shine of gold, but its heavy, joyless weight, reminded him that power was not glory, but daily struggle against his own fragility. The throne he had ascended was not merely a seat of rule. It was a symbol of how weakness can be transformed into strength, how despair can be the wellspring of resolve. His body, imprisoned in its painful shell, was not an obstacle for his mind, which remained free. And in that moment, he already knew that despite everything, his reign would endure. Not because of his legs, not because of his arms, but because of the force within him. The iron mask of dignity. Over the years, leprosy did not merely destroy Baldwin's flesh. It slowly corroded the very concept of his body as a sovereign vessel. What was once a youthful face with a clear gaze became a ravaged battlefield where life struggled silently against decay. His skin erupted in ulcers, darkened, cracked. His fingers blackened and withered. His face lost its contours. But in his eyes still burned the fire of will, a will that would not bow to pain, fear, or the rot consuming him. It was then he made a choice. The world would never see him diminished. At first, it was just a veil, soft cloth draped from his brow, shielding the ravaged cheeks and withered lips from curious eyes. But soon came the mask. Forged not for war, but for survival, it became his armor against pity. Simple, steel, cold, without ornament or vanity. There was no gold in it, no grandeur, only the compressed resolve of a sovereign fighting on unseen fronts. It transformed his face into a symbol, a mystery. Was he a ruler or a phantom? Alive or already dead? His warriors, his advisors, even his enemies, none could answer. But they knew this. Behind the mask was a mind sharper than any blade. Baldwin wore the mask before his people, at councils, before his armies. Not a single muscle flinched when pain surged beneath the surface. That was the mask's purpose. Not a sound escaped his lips when his fingers lost feeling. That was its burden. This was not a disguise, but an act of defiance. He did not hide from the world. He concealed his weakness to give strength to his kingdom. The mask became part of the throne itself. With it, he listened to reports, commanded battles, signed decrees, condemned traitors. Even those closest to him no longer knew what lay beneath. He had withdrawn from flesh, becoming a symbol. The iron upon his face was both shield and curse. It erased the man's features and birthed a legend. Somewhere beneath the mask, blood still flowed. Somewhere beneath, flesh decayed. He could smell death lingering beside him, but he would not let it speak. In that mask, he breathed pain, but spoke with power. Eating became torment, drinking a labor, but none ever saw how it happened. Servants remained silent. Physicians were sworn to secrecy. All the people knew was this: their king still stood. He still commanded. He still lived, despite everything. Or perhaps because of it. The mask did not merely conceal disfigurement. It held his image together. In a world where weakness meant doom, he crafted the visage of strength. He became a figure of steel, sovereign over death. And each time he appeared before his people in that mask, it was not merely a gesture. It was a challenge to fate, a reminder that even death bows before dignity. A war without mercy. The flame of the East rose above the horizon. Muslim armies advanced westward in unity, like an unstoppable tide. Crescent moons above the spears, prayers before battle, the cries of horsemen, all of it pressed against the borders of the kingdom of Jerusalem, tightening the noose. Baldwin knew illness could weaken the body, but it did not annul duty. He was a king, and that meant he was a warrior. He had no luxury to remain a strategist in the shadow of a tent. He came out to his troops, standing upon the land he had vowed to protect to the end. His body had begun betraying him. One leg dragged behind. His grip was weakening. Skin beneath armor oozed with infection. Yet he stood tall. His eyes, hidden in the shadow of the mask, remained calm and resolute. Every knight, every foot soldier who looked upon their king knew they were not fighting for gold or land, but for something greater, for the idea embodied by this dying young man. Baldwin led not by words, but by example. He mounted his horse when his back split open beneath the cloak. He climbed the hills when his knees trembled under the weight of steel. He stood at the front, unflinching, when pain gripped his chest like a vice. His suffering was so visible that it made his soldiers ashamed of their own exhaustion. But the enemy did not pity. Saladin and his emirs advanced wisely and relentlessly. Their attacks struck like daggers. They knew the kingdom was weakening, that the king was ill, that Europe hesitated in offering aid. War showed no mercy. No sword was lowered in sympathy. It was pure hell upon holy ground. And in this hell, Baldwin revealed his greatness. He did not seek pity. He did not beg for mercy. He faced every challenge as though his flesh was untouched, as though pain were an illusion. He commanded his army with the precision of a chess master, despite fevers, convulsions, nights spent in exhaustion. At times he collapsed, right at the war council. He was revived, brought back from the edge, and he rose again, not for himself, but for them. Each victory of his army became not only a strategic success, but a triumph of spirit over flesh. The warriors carried his name like a banner. They believed that if their king would not yield, then none had the right to. His figure, armored, masked, trembling, became a living emblem of indomitable will. Sometimes, he would silently watch the wounded being carried in after battle. In those moments, his own pain seemed to fade, for he saw men with whole bodies dying for the kingdom. That gave him strength. He would not retreat. Never. He could no longer wield a sword, but he fought with his will. He was like a chieftain of an ancient tribe whose body was torn, but whose spirit united nations. His decisions came swift and sharp. He predicted enemy movements, allocated supplies, reinforced fortresses, prepared reserves. He wrote to Western monarchs, not as a beggar, but as an equal. Every battle he engaged in was an act of resistance against death. Even when a skirmish ended in retreat, his very presence made it a moral victory. Soldiers whispered, "He still lives. He is still with us." And there was something mystical in that. He had become almost mythic, a king who could not be killed by sword or sickness. He showed no mercy, not to himself nor to his foes. There was no place for pity in this war, only resolve to stand while breath remained. And even that breath, through blood, pain within, strength. Without Baldwin's body was a battlefield of constant agony. Every morning began in torment. First came the numbness. His fingers refused to move, his hands were alien. Then the trembling in his legs, the weakness in his chest, a crushing heat pressing against his skull. Beneath his skin, it felt like blades crawling through muscle. The decay continued, methodical, merciless. There was not a single part of him untouched by leprosy's kiss, but no one was allowed to see it. He never let pain rule him, not once. Even when he could barely rise from bed, even when physicians begged him to remain in his chambers, he stood. Every step was a battle against darkness, against the pull of fainting, against tearing skin. They wrapped him in bandages, applied salves, rubbed herbs into his flesh. Sometimes he dug his nails into his palm, just to avoid crying out. But his face, beneath the mask, remained composed. He knew, if the king showed weakness, the kingdom would tremble. His strength was not of the flesh. It was of will, of defiance. Even when he could no longer feed himself, his food was served with a special spoon so he would not appear helpless. Even when skin peeled from his face, he stood before his army like a bronze statue. He had become the very image of resilience. At war councils, He sat upright, even if his spine screamed in pain. He listened to reports, analyzed them, pointed to maps, issued precise commands. Sometimes tears fell, not from emotion, but pure physical pain. He wiped them away in the shadows, where no one could see. He demanded to be seen as unshakable, as a tower. Even at night, when his attendants left him alone, he did not allow himself to groan. His body burned with fever, his joints ached, his wounds bled. He dozed for moments, only to awaken in agony. Still, he rose each morning, again and again. His spirit was stretched like a taut rope, a blade that refused to shatter beneath the hammer. His strength fed those who doubted. The weak looked to him and straightened. He had become more than a man. He was an idea, forged in suffering. He did not beg God for mercy. He did not wait for miracles. He simply did what must be done day after day, for as long as breath remained. Not a single day passed without pain, but every day was a victory, quiet perhaps, but real. A victory over flesh, over suffering, over fate. The victory at Montgisard. On the dusk of a solitary autumn day, as the sky burned crimson like inflamed flesh, the Leper King led his army into a battle that seemed doomed from the start. The odds were desperate. Barely 700 knights and a few footmen stood against Saladin's massive host, advancing like a fiery storm. And yet, Baldwin did not retreat. Montgisard, a hill strewn with dry grass and the bones of forgotten skirmishes, became the stage for a decisive trial. There, on the precipice of defeat and annihilation, Baldwin proved that victory does not belong solely to those with more swords. It belongs to those whose will is stronger than steel. He rode at the head of the column, clad in heavy armor, his body tightly bound with bandages, his hands nearly numb. His mask gleamed in the sunlight like the face of death itself. He could no longer wield a sword, but his presence was a weapon. The soldiers looked to him and forgot their fear. Saladin, confident in an easy triumph, pressed forward. His cavalry flanked with precision. Archers drew their bows. Drums thundered like war hammers against the earth. But Baldwin knew, within their reckless confidence lay their weakness. He ordered a wedge formation, shielded the flanks, and gave strict command. Do not charge until the enemy was within breath's distance. The battle ignited like wildfire. The air filled with screams, steel, and the screams of horses. But at the heart of the storm, Baldwin stood firm, an anchor of iron. His Templars, young and fierce, fought to the death, emboldened by his calm. Though barely able to grip the reins, he directed the assault. Each movement sent shocks of agony through his flesh, but not a single muscle wavered. The fight raged until sundown. Lines broke and reformed. The earth ran red. Baldwin was nearly thrown from his horse once, when it took a wound. He was steadied, but refused to leave the field. He had to be seen, until the end. And then, at day's final breath, Saladin's army wavered. They had not expected such resistance. Their lines buckled. Commanders scrambled to regroup, but it was too late. The Crusaders, led by a dying king, drove them down the hill, in dust and dread. It was a total victory. Montgisard became a symbol of the impossible made real. Soldiers wept from exhaustion and joy. They lifted Baldwin upon their shields as ancient tribes once did their kings. He did not smile, his mask hid all, but within him burned something disease and fate could never extinguish. Faith. This triumph was recorded in chronicles, but not as the glory of an army, as the triumph of one soul, who by all rights should have been long dead, and instead had saved a kingdom. The fate of the wounded lion. With each passing year, the disease claimed more of him. Baldwin, the king whose will defied time and pain, increasingly felt his body deteriorating. His skin was riddled with lesions, his fingers barely moved, and his wounds, as if whispering reminders of his mortality, tormented him more and more. Yet, on the battlefield, in the council hall, he remained unchanged, immortal in spirit, and unbroken in duty to his realm. The kingdom, once not just land, but the heart of Christendom in the east, now stood on the edge. Enemies pressed in, and support from the west was fading. But Baldwin saw no other path. He was a knight. He was a warrior. Though his flesh was ravaged, his resolve was untouched. The illness had slowly stripped him of all that once made him strong. His face, once full of youthful determination, was now hidden behind a mask, shielding both the eyes of others and his own from his suffering. He could no longer fight in the vanguard as before, but his mind, sharp and disciplined, had become his sword. He became a symbol of endurance, of bravery and determination. But his inner agony was visible to none but those closest to him. The wounded lion, bearing not only the burden of disease but the weight of an entire people, stood ready to confront the fate of his nation and crown. In his eyes, pain and strength coexisted, a strength no longer of the body, but of spirit. He had ceased to be just a man. He had become a symbol. In him, wisdom and frailty, courage and torment, intertwined. It made him both a tragic and a magnificent figure. He made a decision that would shape the future. His strength was waning, and he had to find someone to carry on his legacy. Baldwin had no heir, and his brothers were unfit to succeed him. The matter of succession could no longer wait. He chose his successor not out of desperation, but with the clarity of a dying ruler who had stared mortality in the face. Into that chosen one, he poured his hopes, entrusting him with the continuation of a fragile dream. This act was more than political foresight. It was his final act of heroism. Despite incurable illness, he took control of destiny. He did not conquer death in body, but in meaning. For his ideals, his sense of justice, and his protection of the people lived on in the decision. The fate of the wounded lion was not to vanquish his foes, but to become the one who passed on hope. There were moments when his strength would fail him, when a fog would settle over his mind. In those hours, he leaned on his loyal advisor, like a final shield, and even as his body weakened, his purpose remained. His life had become a battle not for survival, but for the future of those who stood beside him. The Leper King became more than legend. He became proof that, even in the harshest of circumstances, strength could be found to make the most vital decisions. Each day, his body declined, yet his eyes burned with the fire, seen only in those who know the weight of never surrendering. And despite the disease, he continued to shape destinies, govern his kingdom, and lead his army in the fight for freedom and sovereignty. The throne and intrigue. The royal throne of Jerusalem, lined with silk and carved from dark cypress, stood increasingly empty. Baldwin IV could no longer attend the council regularly. His body grew weaker, and his face was ever more hidden beneath a veil and a mask of metal. Yet, even when he was absent from the throne room, his spirit lingered there, as a shadow, as a force of will, as an invisible presence that made voices hush. Thoughts tread cautiously, and even the boldest lords hesitate. With each passing month, unrest deepened within the corridors of power. The king's illness became a subject of whispers, gestures, furtive glances, and long, secretive meetings behind closed doors. Advisors, barons, churchmen, and nobles all felt the winds of change gathering. Some plotted, others asserted claims, and many dreamed of a malleable monarch, a puppet on the throne. But no one dared speak openly, not out of fear of Baldwin the warrior, but out of awe for Baldwin the legend. The king was not blind to these stirrings. He knew which hands were preparing to seize the scepter the moment it slipped from his fingers. He recognized the opportunists, the liars, the flatterers. He knew, because in his youth, he had watched these same games unfold from the sidelines. Then a prince, stricken by illness and without a future. Now he was a king, still sick, but with a legacy that no one could erase. He gathered around him only those whose loyalty had endured time and trial. He trusted few, but their influence grew. He wrote commands not only of legal weight, but of moral vision. Though his hands trembled, his mind remained sharp. Quietly, he began weaving his own web of influence, unseen, like the shadow cast by a curtain in sunlight, but no less real. A central issue gnawed at the heart of the court: the lack of a direct heir. Baldwin's sister Sibylla was strong-willed, but her marriages and political associations stirred fierce debate. Many feared that if she took the throne, her husband, widely distrusted and seen as ambitious, would rule through her. Intrigue surrounded Sibylla like a storm, with factions clustering around her, offering support while secretly chasing power. Despite his condition, Baldwin made a fateful decision. He crowned a co-ruler. He named Baldwin V, his young nephew, just 8 years old, as his successor. The boy became king in name, while Baldwin IV continued to reign in truth. With this single act, the Leper King struck at the heart of many conspiracies. The kingdom now had a future monarch, and the claim of a power vacuum was diffused. It was a masterstroke, delivered at the very moment his enemies thought he was no longer capable of command. But the scheming did not end. It only shifted. Around the young boy arose new circles of influence. Sibylla, her supporters, rival knights, clergymen, the Templars, the Hospitallers, all moved to secure their place. This political storm raged as Baldwin lay increasingly bedridden. His body failed him, but his thoughts were still like arrows, quick, precise, and unflinching. From his bed, through sleepless nights and the agony of decay, he continued to issue orders, receive envoys, review letters, and amend decrees. When the city quieted, he could hear the ticking of time, pressing him forward. He felt the end approaching, not with fear, but with a deep sense of duty. Death was no longer his enemy. Chaos was. His task was not to live long, but to leave behind stability. Thus, in Jerusalem, the Leper King continued to rule, not with a sword in hand, but with iron will in his heart. His mask became a symbol of power, not of menace, but of respect. The people did not see his face, but they saw his resolve. They did not hear his footsteps, but they felt his presence in every law, every command, every decision. The intrigues persisted. People conspired, bribed knights, promised titles, and made secret pacts with enemies. But the Ghost King, now nearly a shadow, still held the throne, and that in itself was his final political miracle. Hands that do not feel. His hands had once been strong. In childhood, Baldwin held the sword with ease, gripped reins tightly, climbed walls with agility, and played soldiers' games in which he always triumphed. Those hands remembered the heat of Judean sand, the leather of saddles, the steel of blades, the blood of enemies, and the warmth of prayer. But now, they were foreign to him. Fingers that were once quick and sure had gone numb. They only moved when he watched them and commanded them with thought alone. He no longer felt touch, nor pain, nor the weight of objects. Leprosy, like a patient assassin, was severing his body from his soul, little by little, slowly, irreversibly. Each morning began with inspection. His servants would carefully remove his bandages and replace them. His fingers were wrapped in linen, hidden beneath gloves. They looked like those of a dead man, pale, lifeless, with swollen joints and blackened nails. Infections gnawed at his skin, and at times, fluid seeped from the wounds. But the king never complained. He allowed no one to see his weakness. His gloves became an extension of his royal will. Metallic, elegant, sometimes adorned with enamel and gemstones, they concealed a truth the people could not bear to see. He could no longer hold a sword as before. When he tried to grip the hilt, his fingers disobeyed. Yet to the eyes of his people, he remained the warrior king, because he had learned to hold a weapon as one holds a banner, not for killing but for symbol. even if the sword in his hands no longer struck fear by blade. The image of him wielding it inspired loyalty and dread in equal measure. But beyond the battlefield began his truest war, a war of governance, bureaucracy, diplomacy, laws. Where he once raised a blade, now he wielded parchment and decree. Signing edicts took effort, using his seal pressed with both hands. Sometimes a secretary wrote in his place, but the decisions were always his. Even when he could not grip the pen, he gave commands that shaped lives and altered destinies. These were hands that no longer held weapons, yet held the scepter of justice. His servants feared to touch him, not from the threat of infection, but from reverence. Every gesture, no matter how faint or trembling, still held power. He had learned to rule a kingdom without ever touching it, moving through thought, intention, and unwavering focus. All that he touched, he felt not through skin, but through heart. He no longer sensed the pulse of life, not in hands nor in feet, but he sensed responsibility for every voice, every stone of the city, every soldier's step. In that, he found a new and hidden strength. The absence of sensation sharpened his awareness. His eyes grew keener, his voice quieter yet more commanding, his judgments firmer. Many could not understand how a man so afflicted could govern armies, politics, and alliances. But it was precisely in his physical silence that a new sensitivity was born, toward people, toward justice, toward truth. The king who could not feel his own hands understood the world more deeply than any healthy man. He trained himself not to look at them, not to study or mourn what they once were. He focused instead on what he had become, a ruler who governed with thought, not muscle. His hands were no longer tools of war. They were symbols of pain and of authority. He continued to command, to seal treaties, to receive oaths of loyalty, to shake hands with envoys, though he could not feel their grip. People bowed before him, not because of his strength, but because of his resolve. His hands, though numb and scarred, became emblems of an age in which strength was measured not in might, but in will. He lived as if submerged in water, where motion slowed and sensation blurred. But he endured, day after day, night after night, holding the realm in those very hands that no longer belonged to him. He became a king without touch, but with a touch that reached the hearts of his people. And in that lay his final, deepest victory. Brotherly fears. Greatness of a crown rarely comes without a shadow. And in Jerusalem, the shadow was long, deep, and cold. The Leper King ruled, but he was not immortal. And fear, not mere worry, but a fear for the future, for order, for the royal house, settled in the hearts of the two women closest to him, his mother Agnes and his sister Sibylla. Baldwin IV had no children. His body made that impossible. Few knew this for certain, but many suspected. In the royal house, this truth was like salt in an open wound. He sat alone on the throne, but behind him stood a dynasty that swayed like an ancient column, corroded by time and faction. Sibylla, his sister, was beautiful, clever, and stubborn. The same fire that burned in him flickered in her, though softer and more patient. She loved her brother, but each passing year darkened that love with anxiety. Who would inherit the throne? Who would rule this fractured kingdom, surrounded by swords, walls, crosses, and crescents? Their mother, Agnes of Courtenay, a sharp and pragmatic woman, understood the cost of weakness and the price of power. She saw in her son a hero, but a dying one. And she knew that if no plan was made, the crown would be torn apart like cloth in hungry hands. Baldwin understood it all. He saw the tension on his sisters' and mother's faces, heard snatches of conversations whispered in corridors, felt the cautious footsteps near his chamber doors. He knew that even love trembles before the throne. He knew their fear for the dynasty did not negate their respect for the king. But it was a different fear, the fear of those who would live beyond him. Sibylla had already been married, but her husband William had died, leaving her a son. This boy, Baldwin V, became the faint light of hope for all who wished for a future without bloody chaos. But the boy was young. His fate hung by a thread. Many thought him too fragile, too untested. Many feared he would be a puppet in other men's hands. That fear birthed new whispers, new plots. Though Baldwin IV had named him co-ruler, he knew one coronation was not enough. The child would need guardianship, protection, wisdom he could not yet possess. And there, in that silent crisis, his sister and mother entered their invisible battle. Some believed Sibylla must remarry to a powerful man who could shield her son. Others insisted that she herself should rule, bypassing the boy, for she bore the blood of Jerusalem. Around them gathered lords, clergy, and generals. Each wanted a hand in the future of the realm. Each whispered, maneuvered, promised. Fear became the fire of ambition. Baldwin felt it. His own body was a battlefield of pain. But beyond the palace walls, another agony brewed, the fear of losing everything he had tried to build. His sister often came to see him. She sat by his bedside, holding his hand, the one that no longer felt touch. He knew she looked at him with sorrow, but also pride. He was her brother and her king, her martyr and her myth. But he was mortal, and she was afraid. Agnes, their mother, rarely showed emotion. She came less often, but her gaze weighed more than words. She spoke of the future, of politics, of arrangements. She did not plead. She did not beg. She declared. She demanded decisions. She sought stability. And perhaps, in her ambition, she sought the throne, not for herself, but through her daughter, her grandson, her lineage. Baldwin did not resent them. He understood. Their fear was a mirror of his own pain. He fought not only disease, but the realization that even his dearest ones looked at him through the veil of time, already seeing what must come after. But he did not let fear break the family. He acted. He spoke with bishops, with lords, with knights. He built a future even as his body crumbled. He remained a brother protecting his sister. He remained a son respecting his mother, even when her ambitions stirred anxiety in others. The fear was great, but his will was greater. And though his hands felt nothing, his heart still beat, and beat for those who feared the most. Saladin, enemy and respect. On the sun-scorched fields of Palestine, where bones turned to dust and blood soaked into stone, war had long ceased to be merely a matter of faith. It was survival, order, destiny. Two armies stood opposed, but their leaders were not mere commanders. They were symbols of entire civilizations. One, a king whose body decayed from within, gripping a sword he could no longer feel. The other, a sultan, mighty, majestic, the unifier of Islam. And between them, through the fire and steel, something unexpected emerged. Respect. To many in the Christian West, Saladin was the embodiment of dread. He came from the desert with faith and blade, conquering cities, toppling fortresses, reshaping the map. His name became both curse and legend, whispered at night by anxious mothers to restless children. But to Baldwin IV, he was not merely a foe. He was an equal, a test, a trial sent by God not to destroy, but to measure the strength of spirit. Their first encounter was not on the battlefield, but in reports, letters, messengers, intelligence. Baldwin, already ravaged by the disease, read dispatches about Saladin's advance, his discipline, his mercy and severity, his strategy. He studied the man who marched on his lands, not as a barbarian, but as a sovereign. In these accounts, there was little blind rage. There was intent, structure, command. That unnerved the king, but also intrigued him. Their first indirect clash came at the Battle of Montgisard, Saladin was forced to retreat. Baldwin had led his forces in person, though he could barely sit upright in the saddle. His body soaked in sweat, his hands wrapped in cloth, his face hidden behind veils. A living corpse in golden armor, yet he led, and he won. Saladin remembered. Years passed. They clashed again and again, sometimes in battle, sometimes in negotiations. They never met face to face, but their minds crossed paths through strategy, letters, and decisions. Saladin, despite the holy war he waged, never mocked Baldwin's condition. He never exploited the king's physical weakness. He respected him as a warrior who refused to yield even as his own body betrayed him. There came a moment when Baldwin fell seriously ill, and Saladin ordered his troops not to disturb Jerusalem. A gesture, rare, almost unheard of in times of war. But it was made, not for faith, for the man, for the enemy who had become something greater than a target. Baldwin felt this. In the night, as pus oozed from his wounds and his guard's boots echoed on cold stone, he thought of Saladin, not with hatred, with curiosity. He understood they were both dying in their own ways. Baldwin from disease, Saladin from the burden of rule, from the impossibility of lasting peace. And both knew war between them was inevitable, but not meaningless. It was like the struggle between wind and stone. When Saladin offered truces, Baldwin did not reject them out of pride. He calculated, weighed the cost. He knew that sometimes peace was a greater triumph than conquest. That sparing the blood of one's people could be a sharper sword than steel. In those decisions was the wisdom not of a young king, but of a dying lion, whose spirit still blazed, even as his flesh failed. Thus a bond was formed, not an alliance, not friendship, but mutual respect. Saladin saw in Baldwin not just a dying man, but a king worthy of honor. And when Baldwin died, rumor spread that Saladin ordered a prayer be said for him, not as a brother in faith, but as a noble adversary, whose passing was a loss to the world. Not merely a victory for the map. It was a victory no one expected. The triumph of respect, more enduring than steel, more lasting than thrones. Judgment in the shadow of death. When the disease devoured his hands, disfigured his face, and drained the warmth from his joints, Baldwin IV remained a judge, not only by title, but by essence. His throne was not merely a symbol of authority, it was the seat of justice, maintained even as his flesh slowly surrendered to decay. Even when his own body refused to obey, he delivered verdicts with a clarity that unsettled those who hoped the Leper King would falter. The Hall of Justice in Jerusalem was a place where fear met solemnity. Marble columns, dusty arches, and the flickering of candles cast shadows on the walls like reminders of life's fragility. When the king entered, silence fell like a veil. He no longer walked on his own. He was carried on a litter or supported by two knights, one on each side, like saints guarding a relic. His face was hidden behind a silver mask, beneath which festered wounds, blood, and unspoken pain. But his voice did not tremble. It rang out like steel, sharp, cold, without pity, without flattery. He knew the whispers behind his back, the conspiracies spun by lords, who watched his every breath. He knew that even those kneeling before him did so not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear of the last breath of the old world and the first hammer blow of the new. He issued sentences and sealed fates, not with a hand that could no longer feel parchment, but with a mind untouched by pus or death. His judgments were impartial. He spared no friends, sought no revenge against foes. Even in agony, he stood above emotion. That terrified people. That earned their respect. At times, he was taken personally to the prisoners, to dungeons where traitors, murderers, and false prophets rotted. He listened to their confessions in silence, saying nothing until his lips uttered, "So it shall be." Those three words decided all: life, death, mercy, oblivion. He, whose face had partly vanished, had become the face of law. Some nobles tried to challenge him. They spoke of tradition, questioned his age, whispered of the king's weakness. But he merely looked at them through the slits in his mask, and in those eyes was something they could not withstand: strength in frailty, light in rot, a verdict from which there was no appeal. Rumors crept through the streets. The people whispered that the king was no longer a man, but a spirit imprisoned in flesh. Some feared him, others prayed for him, but none doubted. Under Baldwin IV, justice stood firm, even if his hands could no longer grip the scepter. In the final months of his life, he continued to judge. Lying in bed, unable to rise, he received letters, petitions, and reports. He read them while his eyes could still see. He dictated responses while his lips could still move. His scribes recorded every word spoken between waves of agony, and each one became law. Thus, the king, dying with every breath, remained the final voice of justice. His voice was the last many criminals ever heard. His word was the final hope of the innocent. His silence, the most terrifying sentence of all. Baldwin IV was dying, but until his final day he was the voice of judgment. And thus, his throne, cloaked in the ashes of pain, shone more brightly than many who ruled without ever knowing suffering. Battle against time. Each morning began with pain, not sorrow or doubt, but raw, consuming pain, the kind that would make even the strongest men weep in darkness. But Baldwin IV did not weep. He did not allow himself the luxury of weakness, not even in the solitude of his chamber, not even when no servant or knight was present. He awoke, if he had slept at all, and met the dawn like a warrior greets battle, knowing that every moment was a duel with death stretched across years. Time was his true enemy, not Saladin, not the schemers at court, not even the agony that broke his bones and burned through his joints. Time. It crept through his veins, dissolved his muscles, slowed his speech, dimmed his sight. It stole from him the ability to hold a sword, to write commands, even to breathe without effort. And each day, Baldwin knew time was winning. But still he fought, not for himself, for the kingdom. He didn't count the days. Numbers lost meaning when the body had its own calendar of sores, tumors, and dying skin. He asked no mercy from God, knowing his fate was to witness the slow ruin of his flesh. He asked only for clarity of mind, to the very end, because while his thoughts remained sharp, he was still king. Physicians brought him ointments, herbs, washed the decaying limbs, changed the bandages that reeked of death. His body had long begun to rot, but his spirit never. He still called councils, dictated decrees, received envoys. They lifted him from bed, fastened him to the throne with straps to hold his body upright. And in that unmoving figure, cloaked and masked, the pulse of a living realm still beat. Sometimes he thought he was already dead, that everything unfolding around him was just a dream, a shred of consciousness stuck between worlds. But then came a messenger with news of an invasion, a diplomat offering peace, or a beggar pleading for justice. And he remembered who he was. He was not flesh. He was will. And will does not die, so long as it is chosen. Time took many things: friends, his voice, his vision, even memories of his childhood. But it could not take his sense of duty. He looked at the map with almost blind eyes and moved armies in his mind. He could no longer ride a horse, but he knew who should lead the knights. He could not grasp a sword, but he decided where blood would be shed. He was a strategist without strength, a general without hands, a king without a body, and still a king. Each morning, as servants peeled away blood-soaked bandages and skin came off in sheets, he whispered to himself, "I am still alive." It was not a phrase of joy. It was a challenge to the world, to the disease, to time itself. He lived in defiance, as though each breath could bend the course of history. And when night came, he did not pray for rest. He prayed for dawn, one more. Because as long as morning came, there was still a king. And as long as there was a king, the kingdom endured. The mask could not shield the pain. The mask was silver, heavy, cold. It clung tightly to his face, as if replacing what had been lost. Beneath it, wounds, bleeding, festering, unprotected from touch, but hidden from sight. People grew used to seeing the mask and stopped asking what lay beneath. It became the king's second skin, his shield, his silent scream. But even the strongest mask could not shield him from pain. Baldwin wore it not only at ceremonies and councils, but also in battle, in private meetings, even in solitude. At first, it was to conceal the disease, then to preserve the image of the king, and in the end, just to hold himself together, to keep his face from falling apart like porcelain, undone by a careless glance or a breeze. Inside the mask, his skin festered, rotted, swelled. It was removed only for dressings, when the room filled with the stench of death, thick enough that nights turned away. But Baldwin was silent. He endured. He knew that if he let out even one scream, everything would fall. His throne, the order of the court, the belief in his strength, He held onto that mask the way he held onto power, with courage that punished the flesh. Sometimes, in rare moments of stillness, he would touch the inside of it with his fingers, feeling neither pain, nor fabric, nor metal. He no longer felt his face, only the throbbing burn beneath the skin, a reminder, you're still alive. But every second wearing the mask was a trial. Its edges dug into swollen flesh, metal scraped open sores, breathing was difficult. At times, blood seeped through the slits at the mouth, but he never let anyone wipe it away. The people saw only the polished surface, a symbol, an image of the undefeated. Many believed it was merely a piece of armor. Legends grew. Some said the king's face was so holy that no one could gaze upon it. Others claimed he glowed beneath the mask, that he was immortal. But the truth was different. Beneath the mask was a man who paid for every moment of existence with pain, with no right to relief. When he appeared before the people, he did so with pride. His gait was growing unsteady, but the mask gave him stature. Even enemies bowed, not out of fear or faith, but because they knew. Behind that expressionless metal, there was suffering, turned into armor by choice. At night, sometimes, he couldn't sleep from the pain that gripped his skull like shackles. But even then, he did not remove the mask. Not for himself, not for a mirror. It had become part of his will, his silent vow. While it remained on his face, he was still king. And as long as he was king, he was bound to endure. How many faces the disease had stripped away, no one knew. He no longer remembered what he once looked like. But beneath the metal, beneath the disfigured flesh, there remained light. Not divine, not mystical, but human. The strength to be more than pain, to be more than a body. The mask did not protect him from suffering, but it allowed him to hide it. And that meant to win day by day. As long as the heart beat, as long as the crown did not fall, as long as silence did not become eternal. Peace amid leprosy. Leprosy chooses no hour. It tears down the walls between night and day, between youth and age, between life and death. Baldwin knew this. He felt each sunrise bringing a new crack in his body, a new tear between flesh and bone. But even when his body betrayed him, his mind remained a weapon, sharp, precise, and unrelenting. War was constant. Peace was temporary. And yet, in a body decaying faster than the world could age, he found a path to reconciliation. He made treaties as if his hands were not rotting beneath his gloves. He negotiated even when his mouth barely moved from pain. He studied maps with bandaged eyes. He had no luxury of comfort, but he possessed a will that had no need for physical strength. Baldwin understood. One battle could be won, but far more valuable was preventing it altogether. He did not wait for Saladin's army to strike Jerusalem again. He sent envoys ahead, with offers of peace, terms of truce, with gifts and threats woven into a single message. Where others saw weakness, he revealed foresight. That was the paradoxical power of his reign. A man with a dying body was capable of sustaining peace between nations whose bones had not yet begun to rot. No one wanted to accept terms from a diseased king, but they had no choice. Because behind the leprosy was strategic brilliance, discipline, and rare wisdom. Baldwin knew the worth of resources, how many lives a single well-written treaty could save. He did not need to shout in his council. His faint voice carried the weight of judgment, forged not from fear, but from the daily endurance of pain. He built alliances when he could no longer rise from bed. His fingers could no longer hold a quill, but he dictated with the clarity of a general who never missed a maneuver. His face was hidden, but in every word, one could feel. This was a man whose time was vanishing, but whose mind still led a kingdom forward. Leprosy didn't cloud his judgment, it sharpened it. It stripped away illusion. He sensed betrayal before it was spoken. He spotted weakness behind courtiers' veils, and he found allies in the most unexpected places. He signed treaties with emissaries of the East, spoke with merchants, knew whom to welcome to court and whom to exile forever. He did not believe in eternal peace, but he believed in a pause, in the chance to give his people one more year, one more spring, one more harvest. And for that pause, he fought, not by raising a sword, but by raising his head, heavy, masked, aching, but still noble. Baldwin forged peace on his own terms. His enemies could not understand how a man who was physically falling apart could hold the world around him together. But that was his royal art, the art of ruling not with his body, but through the realm itself, through the power of thought, through the chill of reason, through patience born of fire and affliction. While others debated, he acted. While the world wondered how he still lived, he maintained a fragile balance between war and peace, between ruin and salvation, between fear and dignity. Leprosy took his flesh, but Baldwin built a legacy. And even when almost nothing of him remained, his will lived on in the throne, in the treaties, in the letters and seals. And so, peace lived on too. The wisdom of the dying death followed him closely, never falling behind, but never rushing. It watched him rise each morning with a face that could no longer be recognized. It stood by as servants helped him pull gloves over fingers that had long ceased to feel. It was there when he coughed blood, when his knees buckled from the strain of a single step. And still, it did not take him. It waited, curious to see how far a mind condemned by the body could go. Baldwin knew. He was dying. Not suddenly, not soon, but day by day, bit by bit. His departure was drawn out over years, like a sentence passed by fate, whose execution was postponed. He saw it in the eyes of his physicians, in the worry of his sister, in the silent respect of his knights. And yet, with each day, his words grew wiser. His mind sharpened where the flesh weakened. In his decisions, he became cautious, precise, nearly cold. He no longer needed emotion. He would not allow anger to cloud judgment. Fear, though well-earned, no longer touched him, because the true battle was now internal, not for life, but for meaning. And he was determined to win it. His wisdom showed in small things. He noticed what others missed: the shift in a counselor's tone, the symbols scribbled on enemy letters, the whispered conversations of guards in the courtyard. He understood the weight of every choice, because he had only so many left. He learned to extract the essence, casting off the noise. His voice grew softer, yet it held no less power. He began preparing for succession, not out of fear of death, but out of respect for the future. He issued orders that would take effect after he was gone. He evaluated alliances, not for convenience, but for durability. He searched for the wise, not the loyal. And he knew his final duty as king was not to rule, but to ensure that rule could continue. Each day he listened more and spoke less. His decisions grew deeper. People came to him with quarrels and left with peace. He judged with fairness, without haste. His face, hidden behind a mask, showed no anger, no pity. It was a mirror of fate, one he had already accepted. Death stood beside him, no longer an enemy. It had become part of his authority, not as an ending, but as a reason to act with clarity. Its shadow gave weight to his actions. Baldwin did not fear it. He feared only one thing, that he might leave without leaving behind order. And so his wisdom shone. It flowed from pain, sharpened with every flare of illness, deepened with every new wound. He felt the world inside him becoming clearer, as all that was unnecessary withered away with his body. Only the essential remained: justice, foresight, and loyalty to duty. He was no saint, yet his words became like prayers. He was not immortal, yet his decisions outlived many. He was not beloved by all, but even his enemies bowed to his reason. The wisdom of the dying proved stronger than the strength of the living. He did not die a victim of disease, but a sovereign completing his journey, with a clear mind, a heavy heart, and eyes not lost in darkness, but fixed on a future still worth saving. The Prince Regent. By the time Baldwin IV's body had become nearly motionless, when he could barely rise from his bed and spoke only with effort, there was no longer any doubt. The kingdom needed a successor. The question was no longer whether the king would live. It was who would lead Jerusalem when Baldwin's voice fell silent forever. He could not allow the throne to be devoured by the struggle of ambitions. His sister Sibylla, beloved but headstrong, was already caught in the web of court intrigues. Around her swarmed nobles hungry for power, for crowns, for titles. Baldwin saw it all. Even if his eyes had grown dim, the sharpness of his mind had only deepened. He understood. If he didn't act now, the kingdom would fall not to Eastern enemies, but to the poison of its own palace. He made a decision, not with his heart, but with his reason. He appointed a co-ruler, a small boy, Sibylla's son, his own nephew, a child still moldable, still guidable, still surroundable by the loyal. And with that decision, Baldwin constructed a system to ensure that power remained in the hands of those who could hold both sword and seal when he could no longer lift a spoon. The boy was too young to understand the shadow now cast upon him. He did not know that his name would become the kingdom's shield, while his uncle, the king, faded day by day. But Baldwin knew, and he surrounded the young prince with men chosen by an unrelenting hand, not those who bowed the lowest, but those who stood the firmest. He prepared chronicles so the future would remember, left letters to explain his choices. He established rules of regency so no one could twist the will of a dying man. He could not guarantee the eternity of his plans, but he knew that each one postponed chaos for a day, a week, a year. And sometimes that was the greatest work of a king. Baldwin looked upon the child he had named as his regent with a gaze full of resolve, not dreams. He did not yearn for glory. He did not believe his name would live for centuries. He only wished the walls of the holy city would stand, that its people would live under the protection of law, not beneath the shadow of fear. He hoped that this child, guided by the strong, would carry forward not a bloodline, but a duty. Once named Heir, the boy became the symbol of the future, and Baldwin himself, still alive yet nearly a shadow, became the guardian of transition. His suffering was no longer personal. It was the bridge between a dying present and an uncertain tomorrow. He passed down not just power, but faith, and he hoped it would endure when his body was gone and his mask removed forever. The final command. By the time Baldwin's breath had become ragged and uneven, the walls of his chambers were saturated with the scent of herbs, blood, and the slow smolder of life itself. Servants moved in silence as though afraid to disturb the thin veil separating the king from eternity. Everyone knew the final hours were near, but the king was still alive. And he knew. The final word had to be given before silence became forever. His body no longer obeyed him. He lay on the bed propped by pillows, his face almost entirely covered by linen wrappings and a mask. All that remained of him were his eyes. Dim, faded, but full of thought. He no longer felt his fingers, his legs, not even pain. Not because it had vanished, but because it had long since become background noise. He had spoken barely anything in days. His lips were cracked, his voice reduced to a rasp, and his tongue had grown heavy. But his mind remained intact, sharp, deliberate, as if it had separated from the decaying body and hovered above it, pure and unyielding. He summoned his scribe with slight gestures. He dictated not with words, but with his gaze, his breath, faint movements. The final command was not of war. It concerned no battle, no siege, no vengeance. It was the command of a sovereign mind concerned with the future, with order, with the people who would remain after him. It contained instructions for the regency, provisions for food distribution in times of famine, secret directives for border defense should enemies seize the moment. Even in his last hours, he thought not of himself. He signed the decree with great effort, holding the quill that had been placed in his unfeeling hand. His hand trembled, the line of his signature wavered but remained legible. It was not merely a name, it was the final punctuation of a life, written by a hand that no longer sensed the weight of the quill or even its own existence. He gave his final order lying nearly unconscious, when only the will of his spirit kept him tethered to the world. Those beside him dared not weep, for in his silence there was strength. He was not dying as a sufferer. He was dying as a sovereign who had fulfilled all that was required. His gaze drifted to the ceiling, pausing now and then, at the window where light broke through, or at the face of his sister who held his numbed hand. The final command had been given. From that moment, he could let go. Everything had been passed on. Every word recorded. Every intention made known. Even in death, he remained a king, ruling not with hands, but with will, not with flesh, but with mind. His mask was no longer the face of disease, but the face of a dying intellect stronger than decay. The silence that followed his command was different. It was not the hush of a man dying. It was the stillness after something final had been spoken, after history had written its last chapter and the pen had fallen. Burial of the Phantom King. The morning Baldwin IV's body ceased to breathe arrived without thunder or omen. The city awoke in silence. Over Jerusalem, the dawn stood windless, strangely still, as if the earth itself did not wish to disturb the peace of the departed. Yet anyone who looked upon the holy city's walls could feel it. The air had changed, lighter and heavier at once. The king was dead. His death was not announced immediately. For several hours, the illusion of life lingered behind the doors of his chamber. Servants entered and exited as though he still commanded. His sister sat by the bedside, clutching his already cold hand. Priests read prayers as if to the living, not out of fear, but respect. Death was not to be hurried. It was to be completed. The coffin had been prepared in advance, crafted from dark cypress, simple in shape, without excessive grandeur, as Baldwin himself had instructed. He had forbidden his face to be seen after death. His body was wrapped in linens, soaked in myrrh and aloe, not for preservation, but to conceal. He understood his disease had disfigured him beyond recognition. He wished to be remembered, not for decay, but for who he had been in life. His intellect, his courage, his will. The funeral was private. Only the chosen were present. advisors, his sister, his mother, a few loyal knights. His body was moved at night under the cover of twilight. There were no crowds, no shouts, only footsteps and prayers, restrained tears, and the flicker of torches against stone walls. He was not buried as a saint, though many believed his suffering resembled that of the martyrs. He was not entombed as a conqueror, though he had won more than one battle. He was buried as a man who had fought death itself, not on the battlefield, but within his own body. His resting place was within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where every stone held a prayer, every whisper echoed with eternity. No statue was erected above his grave, only a plaque bearing his name and the years of his life, and silence. No gold, no painted icons, because everything that needed to be said about him was already held in the memory of those who remained. He became not a corpse, but a legend. Not a face, but a symbol. And when the coffin was sealed, and the last torch extinguished in the chamber where he lay, silence fell. Deep, unfeigned silence. The kind that comes only when it is not merely a man who passes, but an era. Thus was buried the king whom the people would never see without a mask, yet remembered without one. Memory stronger than disease. Weeks passed, then months. Jerusalem lived, breathed, suffered, fought. The gates of the temple opened each morning, the streets filled with the voices of merchants and the footsteps of pilgrims, and yet the shadow of the phantom king still hovered above the city. Baldwin IV was no longer among the living, but he had not vanished. He remained in memory, in fears, in legend, in the minds of all who had once glimpsed his greatness beyond the ruined shell of his body. The soldiers remembered how he, swaying in the saddle, lifted his sword when he could no longer raise his arm, how he appeared at battles when he could no longer sit without agony. They said that his presence alone inspired courage, because if a king condemned to a slow death could still lead them, then no healthy man had the right to retreat. For them, he became the embodiment of valor, silent, stubborn, radiant through disease. The people did not remember the sores, not the smell of ointments, not the bandages, not the mask. They remembered that in the darkest hour of their history, a man sat on the throne who did not fear physical weakness because his spirit was strong. He made decisions, signed decrees, untangled court intrigue, and led negotiations when his hands could no longer lift a goblet and his legs could no longer bear his own weight. And this was what the people remembered when they came to his tomb. His humble grave became a place not only for knights and warriors, but for common folk, bakers, widows, orphans, the sick, those who saw not just a king, but a man who endured suffering without complaint. A mother would bring her son and say, "He was strong, even though he died every day." The elderly laid their hands on the stone and whispered prayers, not for miracles, but for strength, the strength to endure, like he did. Chroniclers began to write not only of wars, but of the king's inner battles. Manuscripts preserved accounts of how he hid decay beneath velvet robes, how his mask grew heavier while his gaze grew deeper. They wrote that enemies respected him more than allies because he ruled not with fear, but with will, not with voice, but with presence. He died as he lived, silent yet majestic. With each passing year, the legend grew brighter, clearer. The leprosy faded from the stories, replaced by the light that had burned within him. His illness had not defeated him. His death was no loss. It was a passage from man to symbol, from flesh to memory. He became part of Jerusalem itself, like its walls, its wind, the stones beneath the pilgrims' feet, unseen but alive. The memory of Baldwin IV lived on, not in spite of his leprosy, but perhaps because of it, for it was suffering that made him real. He did not hide behind palaces, did not flee, did not refuse his crown. He remained where he was needed, until the end. And that is why his name did not disappear, into the dust of centuries. The legend of the veiled face. In the centuries that followed his death, the name of Baldwin IV did not vanish into the rolls of kings, nor fade into dates and dusty annals. It broke free from time, stepped beyond the limits of mortal memory, and became something greater, a legend. Not a fairy tale, not a myth, but a truth so haunting and exalted that it seemed almost impossible. They called him the King with the Veiled Face, and in that image lay everything: courage, suffering, silence, and majesty. Iconographers did not paint his features. No artist dared depict Baldwin's face, for no one truly knew what remained beneath the mask by the time he died. Instead of features, only gold, shadow, and veil. He became a faceless symbol in churches, in the imagination of posterity, in the emblems of the Templars. His image existed beyond flesh. He became a sign of will, one that does not bend under pain. The mask that became his face passed into legend. People told tales of how even death, looking into his eyes through the slits of iron, recoiled for a time. His disease claimed his body, but not his will. His face decayed, but it did not vanish from memory. He was a king who needed no face to rule, no hands to wield a sword, no legs to stand. All he needed was spirit, and his spirit remained unbroken. Pilgrims came to his tomb, placing their hands upon the cold stone as if hoping to absorb a fragment of his endurance. Warriors asked for his courage before battle. Mothers prayed for the strength to bear sorrow. Even enemies, upon hearing his name, felt not hatred, but a reverence, something almost sacred. Baldwin became one who is not forgotten, one who is remembered when all else seems lost. In monasteries, his name was whispered in evening prayers. In battle songs, he was recalled as one who never surrendered, despite bearing the mark of death. In chronicles, he was called the Leper Lion, the Iron King, the Shadow Saint. He lived on in history like a scar lives on the body, a sign of pain that becomes a sign of strength. And even centuries later, when the war for the Holy Land turned into chapters in textbooks, when kingdoms rose and fell, when churches' languages and customs changed, Baldwin IV's name still echoed, not as the name of a king, but as the name of a man who, dying every day, chose to live and to be strong until the end. He became a reminder. Heroism lies not in the strength of the body, but in the choice of the spirit. Thus ended his story, not in defeat, not in oblivion, but in the silence of remembrance, longer than life.